Hi everyone, Matt Klaskowski here, and what I'd like to take a look at here is the sharpening settings inside of Camera Raw 4.2. So there's some newer settings inside of the later versions of Camera Raw, specifically here 4.2, which you can always download for free from Adobe's website. And I want to cover what the sharpening settings are, how to use them, and then at the end I'll make a brief note about the importance and the level of sharpening that I might do inside of Camera Raw. Alright, so let's start off here. Generally in a workflow scenario, I would go through and do everything in the basic tab first. This is my white balance and my exposure and the toning of my photos. After I'm all done with the photo, ready to either A, print it, or maybe B, send it off to the customer, or even if I'm going to maybe move on into Photoshop with it, I'd stop along the detail tab here and do some sharpening. And you'll see right off the bat, there's 4 sliders here when it comes to sharpening instead of 1, which is what we used to have. And it's not just that there's new sliders and more control, but it's that the whole sharpening algorithms and everything behind the scenes is totally new as well. So the first thing we need to do here is, you see at the bottom, it tells you zoom preview to 100% or larger. So if you want to see the sharpening on the screen here, you've got to zoom in to 100%. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I'll just move down, we'll work on this part of the photo right inside here. Okay, so let's start off right at the top, and that's just usually generally the way that I work down through these settings is just from the top down. We start off with the sharpening amount. Think of this amount as the amount of sharpening that you want to apply. No, think of this amount setting as the brightness or the darkness of the sharpening. So when Camera Raw sharpens your photos, what it's doing is it's looking for edges inside the photos. When it finds those edges, it adds contrast by lightening or darkening those edges. Think of the amount setting as how light or bright or how dark do I want to make those edges. Okay, so you can see as I start to crank that up, see what happens? Take it down to 0. I'll start to crank it up here, and you can see what we're doing here. We're making those edges darker. All right, if I look over, maybe look at a different part of the photo, you'll see it take place more. See before and after. Okay, so generally with the mount, you want to keep it somewhere. I go up pretty high. I'll go somewhere between 50 and 100. If you start getting over 100, you start getting into that ultra sharpening area, and you got to be a little bit careful there. The next thing we do is we move down to radius. Radius says, think of it this way. Okay, once Camera Raw finds an edge to sharpen, with a radius of 1, it's saying, okay, spread that sharpening out over 1 pixel from the edges. Okay, when you start to increase the radius, you can go all the way up here to 3. Now it's saying spread it out to 3 pixels beyond the edge that Camera Raw finds. All right, in general, 1 pixel is going to be your setting. That's going to be the sweet spot. If you've got a really bad photo, you might want to think of somewhere around 1.5, maybe close to 2. Give it a try. But most of the time, as you start to get over 1, things are going to start to look really bad. Next thing we do here is move on to detail. And I'm going to move to a different part of the photo just to kind of change things up a little bit. And let's take a look up here. So what detail says is the amount setting is saying, all right, this is the amount of sharpening. This is how bright or how dark to make this sharpening, the contrast that we're going to find. The detail says, how much do you want me to go out and look for these edges? All right, amount and sharpening in general is finding the edges, but detail controls how many edges it goes out and searches for. So a low detail setting means just the really high contrasty edges in the photo. A higher detail setting means Camera Raw is going to go out and it's going to look for all the edges that it can find. Okay, a lot more information. And you can see, take a look at the preview. Before and then after. You can see it's going after a whole lot more than it was. We're still sharpened right now. Okay, but we're sharpened mostly on the extreme contrasty edges. As I start to increase this detail, Camera Raw is going to go out and it's going to find more things to sharpen. Think of this, you can start to see it happen here. It's starting to find some of the surface area where it's sharpening, and that might not be what we want. In a portrait, it's really generally bad to go with too much detail because you know what's going to happen? It's going to start to sharpen that skin texture. Okay, and that's not what we want. We really just want the facial features and the really key features to be sharpened. Okay, so be careful with detail, but you can probably crank it up a little bit more here. Now masking, this is kind of where it all comes together. So I've done all this sharpening, and now as I look at this photo, I think that the edges look great, but I think that I have sharpened this inside area a little bit too much. It's starting to look a little bit fake. Well, masking automatically builds a mask in Camera Raw so that you can come in here and mask away the sharpening. All right, and what it does is it starts to mask it away from those smooth surface areas. So as I start to increase this, see what happens? This area is a lot smoother now because I'm masking the sharpening away. Now there's a really cool keyboard shortcut here. It's the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on the PC, and when I hold it down and I click and drag, I can see the mask being built. So what happens here is everything that's white is still being sharpened, but everything that's black is being protected from the sharpening. Alright, so in this example here, this area is that smooth surface area that we don't want to be sharpening. Well, as I start to increase masking, you see how it starts to paint it with black here? So what's happening is the edges are now being sharpened, but this area inside is masked away, or it's hidden from the sharpening. Okay? And don't forget, you can always click your preview up here or just hit the letter P to toggle it on and off, and you can see the effects of your sharpening as long as you're in at 100%. That said, my final closing note here is, how do you know how much to sharpen inside of Camera Raw? Well, if Camera Raw is going to be your only stop along your processing of your photos, if you're not going to go into Photoshop, then go ahead and sharpen it until the photo looks good. Alright, maybe even a little bit more sharpening just for printing. Alright, but if you're going to go into Photoshop, what I do with Camera Raw is I sharpen to the point where everything in the photo looks good. And think of this again in that portrait scenario where normally I'd love to over sharpen the eyes and then go into Photoshop and mask it away. Well, if I sharpen everything in Camera Raw and I over sharpen, I can't go and mask it away inside Photoshop. So I would do just some basic input sharpening in Camera Raw, just some basic sharpening to make the photo look crisp, clear, sharp. Alright, and then I would go into Photoshop and then maybe use a couple different effects to go and do some over sharpening, where I might sharpen the eyes and some of the facial features, and then use layers and masks to paint it away from the areas that might have gotten too sharp from that. So there you have it, an overview of the Detail tab inside Camera Raw, basically the 4 sharpening sliders that you'll get with Camera Raw 4.2.